In the great Nazi stage show, Hitler was the almighty leader who claimed to be a modest man of the people.
Ihr könnt nicht als den Mann sehen, der keiner Klasse angehört. Ich habe nichts als die Verbindung zum deutschen Volk.
He was dedicated to his cause, he was dedicated to Germany. That was all very important to his image, which of course was carefully cultivated by Joseph Goebbels.
The propaganda minister presented his Führer as a humble servant who worked his way up from poverty. It was a distortion of the truth.
Hitler lived a very comfortable life, a very bohemian lifestyle. He got up late. He didn't spend much time in the office. He used to like to have coffee and cakes every afternoon. He liked to watch movies in the evenings. He liked to be surrounded with cronies and friends. People who actually had to do business in the Third Reich, to do business with Hitler, were frustrated by just how little time Hitler was devoted to the business of administration.
Far from the working-class hero confected by Nazi propaganda, it seems that Adolf Hitler, the pampered bohemian who feasted on cream cakes, was also a tax evader. His tax file still survives in the Bavarian State Archives in Munich. It wasn't separated or kept in special storage, but filed along with the records of all the other taxpayers of the region. For economics journalist Wolfgang Strahl, it shows that the so-called man of the people wasn't prepared to pay tax like the rest of them.
This file really is a bit of a lucky find. I was really surprised that it's possible to find original documents here, signed by him, his entire tax files, his objections, his moaning, because apparently he has no money. What is revealed in these files is something of an economic crime story.
Hitler opened his criminal record by becoming involved with the Bavarian insurgency in 1923. In what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler and his small band of Nazi Party followers called for the overthrow of the national government. They staged a public demonstration the next day. A standoff against ranks of Bavarian police ended in violence. 4 police officers and 16 Nazi supporters were killed. Adolf Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in jail for high treason. His coup had failed, but his bid to gain notoriety was a stunning success. His trial and conviction was in the news. He only served 8 months behind bars, but in that time wrote the first volume of his rambling nationalist political manifesto, My Struggle, or Mein Kampf. It would become a bestseller. Mein Kampf was printed by the Eher publishing house. The Nazi Party had bought it in 1920 to establish its propaganda newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, or Popular Observer. The Nazi Party bought the newspaper and the printers using borrowed money, around 250,000 marks. It was a good time to be in debt. It was the beginning of the age of inflation. Hitler could pay back what was once a large sum with inflated marks worth a fraction of the original sum owed. Hyperinflation crippled the economy and eventually destroyed the German mark. The German currency rapidly lost value, and by the end of the 1920s, wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. Millions of Germans were plunged into destitution, but not Hitler or his Nazi Party cronies. They got support from wealthy benefactors at home and abroad. The iconic American car maker and anti-Semite Henry Ford was reported to be one of them.
Henry Ford, America's leading industrialist and iconic figure, was a great enthusiast for Adolf Hitler. The Ford Motor Company had a very important subsidiary in Germany. That subsidiary only went into profit after the Nazis came to power. It went into profit because it was supplying the vastly expanded German armed forces with trucks, with other vehicles. Ford in America profited very handsomely from the Third Reich.
High-profile supporters like Henry Ford gave Hitler credibility. But it was among Munich's conservative, predominantly Catholic upper classes that Hitler found much of his financial support. Some shared his hatred of Jews, democracy and the Weimar Republic administration. Some were wealthy and well-known, like the piano manufacturer's wife, Helena Bechstein.
Bechstein was part of a rich family who made pianos, and also she was kind of a woman about town in Munich, and she sort of took to him and she called him her little son at one point. She even sort of showed him how to behave in upper class company and sort of etiquette around the dinner table. She bought him a top hat and tails at one point as well. So really she became a kind of mentor, benefactor.
She gave Hitler jewelry and other lavish gifts that could be used as collateral for credits. Valuable foreign currency came from overseas benefactors, including American companies. The boundaries between Nazi Party funds and Hitler's personal accounts became blurred. Even some of the Nazi faithful began to question the lavish lifestyle of their leader, dubbed the King of Munich. In 1925, he acquired a 20,000 mark luxury Mercedes and a chauffeur to drive it.
He's driving a Mercedes, which cost incredible amounts of money at the time, can afford to go on travels, and has enough money to finance his propaganda appearances. All of this is financed through a system of slush funds and the donations of larger and smaller benefactors.
But the King of Munich didn't bother to file a tax return. The tax office gave him 8 days to do so, or face a fine, or a day in jail.
At the beginning, Hitler has this image of an ascetic and frugal human being. Initially, he lived as a lodger in Munich, and in his explanations to the tax office, he claims to be a penniless writer.
It doesn't tally with the records. They show that Hitler earned more than 11,000 marks in just 1 quarter in 1925. But he continued to portray himself as a poverty-stricken man who had no assets anywhere, declaring, "I try to restrict my personal needs to such an extent that as a non-smoker and complete teetotaler, I only eat in the most modest restaurants. The vehicle, too, is only a means to an end for me."
We know that behind that propaganda facade, Hitler lived in rather handsome apartments in Munich and in Berlin, that he had a chauffeur, that he had a manservant, that he was surrounded by assistants, that he only had to ask for something, snap his fingers, and it would be obtained for him.
He calculated his taxable income at a fraction of the actual sum. It was the start of a long tug-of-war between Hitler and the tax office. By the end of the 1920s, Hitler was a famous political figure. He didn't officially claim an income from the party. He portrayed himself as an honorary politician. His money came from other sources. But the Nazi Party also needed cash. Its army of brown shirts or SA stormtroopers needed to be paid. The elaborate Nuremberg rallies cost immense sums. But the Nazis' desperate need for money only played into Hitler's hands, and his image as the selfless provider for Germany and the party. A powerful donor reinforced the party's coffers, the Ruhr steel baron Fritz Thyssen.
Thyssen's support was crucial because it showed German industrialists that they had nothing to fear from the Nazi Party. Thyssen was one of those who realized early on that the Nazi Party would be an ally in the ongoing struggle against organized workers in Germany. And Tyson spread that message amongst fellow industrialists, and that diffused one of the important sources of opposition to Hitler's advance towards the chancellorship.
Tyson's lavish donations helped pay for the so-called Brown House, Munich's grand Nazi Party headquarters. In 1929, Hitler also advanced up the property ladder. He moved into a luxurious Munich apartment, now housing a police station. As Hitler upgraded his lodgings, the world economy nosedived in 1929. Germany plunged into crisis. Companies went bust, mass unemployment and poverty gripped the population. Hitler harnessed desperation and fear. The Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive. His simple nationalistic message became even more popular. But while many of his supporters struggled to make ends meet, Hitler was doing very well. In 1929, he declared a gross income of 15,000 marks, the equivalent of around 36,000 euros. His electoral fortunes were also improving. The Nazi Party attracted a flood of votes in 1930, 9 times more than in previous elections 2 years before. They became a recognized force in the German parliament. At the far right, a brown bloc of Nazi delegates represented the second largest political party in the country. Hitler's increased notoriety also increased sales of his political manifesto, Mein Kampf. His official earnings in 1930 escalated to 50,000 Reichmarks. By the end of January 1933, Hitler was Reich Chancellor. He was on the way to becoming an all-powerful dictator, but didn't command an absolute majority. He was appointed Chancellor by the Reich President. Hitler was desperate to ensure that his rise to absolute power was seen as legal, and not the result of the kind of coup he had attempted to lead back in 1923. The Nazi revolution had to have a veneer of legitimacy. Hitler acted the statesman, while his henchmen plotted a rule by terror and intimidation. His rise to power was celebrated like a triumph, but Hitler still lacked support among some parts of the population, including German workers. The Nazi propaganda machine polished his image as a humble, down-to-earth leader.
The publicity machine of the Nazi Party, dominated by Goebbels, was ferociously efficient. It constructed an image of Hitler as an ordinary man, a man of the people.
A speech to employees at a Berlin Siemens factory was a typical example.
Bin aus euch selbst herausgewachsen, bin einst selbst unter euch gestanden und habe mich dann durch Fleiß, durch Lernen und ich kann sagen durch Hungern langsam emporgearbeitet. In meinem innersten Wesen bin ich immer das geblieben, was ich vorher war.
The saluting crowds were hoodwinked. In 1933, their humble leader was earning at least 40 times more than the average factory worker.
There was a certain kind of asceticism about his character, and he was fanatically devoted to his political goals. But the idea that he lived a sort of monkish existence, working night and day simply for the benefit of the German people, was a lie.
According to Hitler's tax file, his annual income amounted to 1.2 million Deutschmarks during the first year of his rise to power alone. Much of that income came from sales of his book, Mein Kampf. 1.5 million copies were sold in 1933 alone. Each book cost a relatively expensive 12 marks, but the price and writing described as turgid and dreadful didn't put buyers off.
After 1933, after Hitler became Chancellor, millions of copies of Mein Kampf were sold in Germany. It was translated into 16 languages. Millions of copies were sold all around the world. Hitler described his profession on his identity papers as writer. And that was true enough. He made a fortune.
But in 1934, a diligent junior tax officer traced this fortune and sent Hitler a steep tax bill.
This tax file shows that he only declared a fraction of his income, and according to the files of the tax office, at the end he owed at least 400,000 Deutschmarks, which was an immense fortune in those days.
The Reich Chancellor was not amused and ordered a state secretary from the Ministry of Finance to intervene.
By the mid-1930s, Hitler is a multi-millionaire, but despite this, he asks for his tax file to be more or less closed. The tax authorities follow his request. It would be unthinkable that a chancellor today might ask not to pay any taxes.
The tax officer, called Vogel, was ordered to make an exception for Hitler. The head of the Munich tax office declared, all tax reports delivering substance for a tax obligation by the Führer are annulled from the start. The Führer is therefore tax exempt. Hitler's tax file was closed. It's not known what became of Herr Vogel, the sharp-eyed official who identified Adolf Hitler as a tax evader. The Führer didn't pay a pfennig of tax for the rest of his life, yet continued to present himself as a humble servant of the people.
Deutsches Volk, gib uns 4 Jahre! Und ich schwöre dir, so wie wir und so wie ich in dieses Amt eintrat, so will ich das gehen. Ich tat es nicht um Gehalt und nicht um Lohn. Ich tat es um deiner selbst willen.
The new government chief seemed to put his money where his mouth was. Hitler publicly declined the chancellor's salary he was entitled to and awarded the money to needy Nazi Party members. But millions rolled in from the sale of Mein Kampf. He wasn't paying any tax, and the humble chancellor soon grabbed back the salary he was entitled to. Just a year later, Hitler quietly reclaimed a wage of almost 30,000 marks, plus an 18,000 mark allowance. All of it tax-free. And yet another bonus was about to roll in. Reich President Paul von Hindenburg was on his last legs. He earned a handsome wage plus allowances. But when he died in 1934, Hitler took over his office and claimed his salary as well. Nazi propaganda still presented Hitler as the humble servant dedicated to the people. He was restoring German pride and employment by taking over vast public works projects like the Autobahn road network. Hitler was buying support, and no one seemed to care about the cost.
The fact that all these measures, including the Reich Labour Service and other benefits, somehow had to be paid for with state credits, that didn't interest the people. People aren't interested in credits and debts, which theoretically rest on their heads. They are only interested in what they have in their own pockets at the end of the day. They want to have more take-home pay, and that's what they got.
The Autobahn myth endures to this day. It was not created by Hitler or the Nazi Party, but based on plans that had existed since 1924. By mid-1935, unemployment had fallen sharply, but had not been eliminated. Those Germans still out of work would soon find full-time jobs making weapons. Military spending had top priority. Germany was being secretly rearmed with public money. Like the Autobahn works, this was also paid for with massive borrowing.
It was completely clear to Hitler that these credits could only be paid for by other still-to-be-conquered people. That means that the armament industry was a very calculated investment for the wartime future of Germany. But there wasn't much talk of this. On the contrary, there was always talk of peace.
Industrialist donors, like the steel baron Gustav Krupp, sensed otherwise. They supported Hitler, expecting lucrative arms contracts in return. They donated hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks following Hitler's rise to power. As well as forging the weapons Hitler needed to rearm Germany, in 1933, Gustav Krupp and his fellow industrialists agreed to make regular donations to Hitler. The main Krupp factory donated almost 5 million marks to Hitler over the course of the war. More and more money was rolling in, and Hitler spent much of it on himself and a lavish retreat in the German Alps. Hitler was a regular visitor to the popular picture postcard spa town of Berchtesgaden. He stayed in a holiday home, Haus Wachenfeld. Hitler had rented it since the 1920s, but in June 1933 had the money to buy it outright. The modest holiday home, furnished in traditional Bavarian style, was to become an imposing estate, and the state would pay for it. Hitler fancied himself as an amateur architect. The redesign of the holiday house into the 30-room Alpine headquarters known as the Berghof became his most important personal project. Hitler's secretary, Martin Bormann, oversaw construction and paid the bills. What wasn't paid for by the state was paid indirectly by German workers through the Adolf Hitler Donation by German Industry Fund. Hitler's Berghof cost Germany millions of Reichsmarks. The dictator admitted himself. The Berghof is a real gold mine. It's just that Bormann isn't getting anything out of it. He just spends a lot on it. Hitler's vast Obersalzberg estate was extended at a massive cost. A second seat of government emerged from the Alpine landscape. Another 30 million marks was spent building a folly on the mountaintops above the Berghof. The Kehlstein House, or Eagle's Nest. An access tunnel and elevator was drilled into the mountainside. Despite the monumental work and cost, Hitler only visited the vertiginous Eagle's Nest a few times. The Führer was apparently scared of heights and disliked the chill, high mountain air. The Eagle's Nest survived the war. Albert Speer's polished brass elevator, the fireplace, and stunning grand alpine views are now open to tourists. But from the 1930s, much of the Obersalzberg was off-limits. As well as Hitler's Berghof, the surrounding complex included houses for Martin Bormann and the Luftwaffe chief, Hermann Göring, and an SS barracks. There was a hotel for high-ranking Nazis and a greenhouse to provide fresh vegetables for the Führer's table. The Obersalzberg became Adolf Hitler's private world. The boss of the Third Reich spent much of his time here instead of the capital, Berlin. Government business was conducted from the terraces and rooms. Nazi bigwigs, support workers, and accomplices congregated around him, including the Nazi foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, and propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels. SS bosses Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich plotted mass murder on an industrial scale amid the Alpine scenery. They all appeared on the home movies belonging to Hitler's secret girlfriend, who also had a room at the Berghof, Eva Braun. The photographer's assistant, who became the Führer's lover, was allowed to roam freely and film private moments. Hitler's loyal armaments minister, the architect Albert Speer, also featured on Eva Braun's films. Speer employed slave labor and used the concentration camp system to keep his factories going, yet talked his way out of being executed as a war criminal after the war. He was also critical of Hitler's design for the Berghoff's famous big window. But not until long after the war, in 1970, when he declared, "The retractable window was Hitler's pride. Below this window, Hitler's vision had placed the garage for his cars, so when the wind blew from the wrong direction, the intense stench of petrol drifted into the living room. It was a sketch that would have been turned away at any technical university." But it was only after his Führer and Nazi Germany were defeated that Speer dared mock Adolf Hitler in public. Eva Braun's former boss, Hitler's personal photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, controlled the marketing of any official images of Hitler. He retained the exclusive rights through his agency. Royalties were payable for every printed photograph, and Hitler probably got his cut. Hoffmann provided pictures for all of the big magazines and publishers. Hitler portraits were printed by the millions, and each one added up to a fortune in sales. Countless postcards were also printed. Adolf Hitler became a kind of pop star, but his stage performances were about to be translated into war. (1938) marked the beginning of Hitler's aggressive foreign policy. His Wehrmacht marched into Austria. The Anschluss, or annexation of Hitler's homeland, was welcomed by many Austrians, and the Nazi dictator wanted to own a part of it. Once again, his faithful secretary Martin Bormann took care of business and bought the house where Hitler was born on his behalf. Hitler received a triumphant welcome in Vienna. He had first set foot in the Austrian capital 30 years before that, attending the opera and sitting in cafes. He dreamed of a career as a painter. He applied for admission to the city's prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. He was turned down due to a lack of talent. Later, Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, "Vienna was and remained the hardest, but also the most thorough lesson of my life." He claimed that he worked as a laborer before painting to earn his keep, which was never enough to satisfy even a modest hunger. But the young Hitler was much better off in Vienna than he made out.
Poverty was a really special point for him. It was very important because he didn't want to say, "I come from a big family and we were all rich." No, Mein Kampf was published between the wars in the 1920s, and it was clear that people said, "My God, this poor man, how he had to suffer."
In reality, it seemed that Hitler suffered little. He started off renting a comfortable flat. His mother left him money after she died. It was enough to sustain him in reasonable comfort for a year. He split the rent with a friend and lived better than many other students at the time.
The two of them saw it like this. We won't work. We'll be something very different. We'll become artists.
The dandy like Hitler spent a lot of time in coffee houses. He would become an artist, an architect, or a set designer. He talked, dreamed, and dabbled in many pursuits, but became master of none. He spent much of his inheritance at the opera, an expensive pleasure. The money left to him by his mother eventually dried up. The young Hitler would have to find work.
The young Hitler would have found work somewhere, but it would have been hard work, something like carrying suitcases, haul stones, whatever. He didn't want that, and he couldn't do that. It's pretty clear that he didn't want to be a worker. He didn't want that. He simply imagined that something would become of him, but he didn't yet know what.
In the meantime, the money ran out, and in the winter of 1909, a homeless Adolf Hitler ended up sleeping in a refuge for the poor. But after a few weeks, he found a single room for himself in an immaculate hostel that also had a place for him to paint. The struggling artist made just enough money to survive by producing uninspired copies of Vienna cityscapes. But in his mind, he was a misunderstood genius and a man of art. He made his triumphant return to Vienna in 1938. He finally got the recognition he'd craved as a young man. The dictator had big plans for his old hometown of Linz. He wanted to turn Linz into the pearl of the Danube, the most beautiful town in Europe. At the heart of Hitler's redesigned city was to be the so-called Führer Museum, a temple dedicated to classic art comparable to the Louvre or the Uffizi galleries. While Nazi propaganda thrived on stylized images of Germanic supermen and women, there was apparently no place for such images in his fantasy Führermuseum. Only works by established classical masters were good enough. Forced evictions and the looting of Jewish homes in and around Vienna provided a rich source of such art.
When Germany occupied Austria, they set up an organized system of expropriation called Aryanization, by which they registered the property, the assets of Jews in Austria, and then systematically stripped them of their wealth. Now, the art collections were part of that asset stripping process.
Purchases were made to appear as legal transactions, even though much of the art had been looted or obtained as the result of forced sales after the Nazi invasion of Austria.
It was a bonanza for German art dealers. They bought up vast private collections and then sold them on the international art market, very largely through Swiss art dealers.
In 1939, the German invasion of Poland marked the beginning of the Second World War. Hitler ordered the invasion of Germany's western neighbors the following year. The Wehrmacht conquered large parts of Europe. Hitler visited Paris for the first time as a conqueror and art collector. Hitler had a new house to decorate in occupied Poland. A stately home in Poznan had been built for Kaiser Wilhelm II when the city was part of the Imperial German Kaiserreich. In Hitler's Reich, it was to become the Führer residency in the East. The interior was refurbished in the same style as the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, at a cost of millions of Deutschmarks. Hitler wasn't only lavishing money on himself, but also dipped into the treasury to reward high-profile military officers to ensure their support. At first, the German army seemed unstoppable in the Soviet Union. Star performers like Tank General Heinz Guderian scored a string of victories. They were rewarded with tens of millions of Reichmarks in bonus payments. As well as money, the Führer handed out estates and titles like a feudal lord. General Heinz Guderian received the lavish estate of Gut Diepenhof in Warthegau near Posen. The estate was valued at more than 1.2 million Reichmarks. Hitler handed it over to his tank general as a gift, tax-free. The original Polish owners were kicked out. But the Red Army spoiled the deal. Guderian and his family weren't able to enjoy the stolen estate. By mid-1944, the Soviets were advancing towards the eastern boundaries of the German Reich. Allied bombers raided German cities and factories at will. Allied landings in Italy in 1943 meant that Austria was now within range of British and American bombers. The art collection that Hitler amassed for his Führermuseum in Linz had to go underground. The Althaussee salt mines in Austria were an ideal hiding place. More than 7,000 paintings and sculptures were stored in the caverns and tunnels deep underground. In the world above, Hitler's Greater German Reich collapsed around him. The Red Army reached Berlin in April 1945. Days before he killed himself, Hitler made his last public appearance, decorating what was left of the defenders of the German Reich. Boys, Hitler Youth fighters. As Soviet troops closed in overhead, Hitler and his entourage prepared for the end in the bunker below the Reich Chancellery. Now sealed and covered by new buildings in the heart of Berlin, this is what was left of Hitler's bunker decades after the war. It was in this claustrophobic complex where Hitler dictated his last will and testament on the 29th of April, 1945. What I own, as far as it is worth anything, belongs to the party. Should this no longer exist, the German state. Should the state also be destroyed, there is no need for a further decision on my part. On the 30th of April, Hitler withdrew from the decision-making process for good, committing suicide with his new bride, Eva Braun. His legacy was wholesale destruction, death, misery, and murder on an industrial scale. Large parts of Europe were devastated by Hitler's total war. Germany and its people were in ruins. Tens of millions of soldiers and innocent civilians were killed. An estimated 6 million Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust. While many German towns and cities were reduced to rubble, Hitler's favorite alpine retreat of Berchtesgaden survived largely intact. But his Berghof headquarters above the town was bombed to smithereens. What was left of Hitler's private property was confiscated by the occupying forces in 1945. It was eventually awarded to the Bavarian state, since it was the last place Hitler registered as his residence. Now in public ownership, surviving structures like the Eagle's Nest or Kehlsteinhaus and the SS barracks below have become a kind of tourist attraction. After the end of the war, authorities tallied up what was left of Hitler's fortune. Much of it came from sales of Mein Kampf. More than 10 million copies were sold up to 1945. Local communities were obliged to buy a copy for couples that married under the Nazi regime. After the war, the copyright was transferred to the Bavarian government. Since then, it has tried, unsuccessfully, to stop the printing and distribution of Hitler's rambling political manifesto.
It was not available for sale to members of the public in West Germany after the Second World War or in East Germany. It was taboo in Austria, but it was never really that hard to get hold of a copy. And it has circulated around the world in many, many translations without any inhibition. And of course now, thanks to the internet, you can read Mein Kampf in any number of languages and download it at the touch of a button.
The Reichsmarks found in Hitler's private account had much less value after the war. The old currency disappeared in 1948 with the monetary reform. The money from Hitler's inheritance went to the Bavarian state. The dictator's other great legacy, the art intended for display in his Führermuseum, is controlled by the German state. Historian Angelika Enderlein looks after the paintings that Hitler acquired from his network of dealers. They were recovered from the Austrian salt mines, where they were hidden away from Allied bombing. Nazi authorities had planned to blow up the entrances before the Americans could reach them, but the demolition plan failed. Thousands of paintings were registered and checked to see if they were stolen. Many pieces were returned to France and the Netherlands, where they were acquired during Nazi occupation. Almost two-thirds of Hitler's collection was deemed to have been legally acquired and was handed over to the new West German state. Investigations are ongoing. Sometimes, new information turns up about the original owners of an artwork.
Seit dem Jahr 2000
Since the year 2000, there has been new research, and the original owner of this painting was a Jew from Berlin, who fled to Vienna.
The original owner, Leo Benville, was murdered in the Buchenwald concentration camp in 1940.
When it became clear that the previous owner was Jewish, the painting was returned from the Federal President's office to our depot. And we are now waiting for the inheritance details of the family, so that we can return the painting to its rightful heirs.
The painting is called Fiat Justitia, or There Will Be Justice in Latin. There was no justice for its former owner, a man hounded from his Berlin home, forced to sell his possessions to flee to Vienna, only to be rounded up there and sent to his death in a concentration camp. Apart from a few buildings in the Bavarian Alps, these storage units contain the last remnants of Hitler's once immense fortune. The man of the people, the great servant of Germany, was a tax evader and handler of stolen art.